Why does silence sometimes carry more weight than 1,000 words? His hand slammed against the steel bulkhead. The sound was flat, ugly, a crack that cut through the low hum of the station's life support like a gunshot. 25 men stopped eating. They stopped talking. Forks hovered over trays. Conversations died mid-sentence. The security chief, a major whose career had been built on physical presence, leaned in. He was a mountain of a man, and his shadow swallowed her whole. She was small, unassuming, a technician in a plain gray jumpsuit with no rank insignia visible. Just another cog in the machine, or so it seemed. "I don't know who you think you are," the major growled, his voice meant to intimidate, meant to be overheard by every man in that mess hall. "But this is my station, my team, my authority. You will follow my protocols, or I will put you on the next transport out of this ice-locked hellhole in a cargo crate. Do you understand me?" She did not look at his hand. She did not look at the faces of the men watching the performance. She did not even look at him. Her eyes, the color of a winter sea, were fixed on the chronometer on the far wall. 67 seconds, 66, 65. Then she gave one warning. Her voice was not loud. It was not emotional. It was a perfectly calibrated instrument cutting through the manufactured tension like a shard of ice. "Major, you have 67 seconds to remove your hand from that bulkhead and return to your duties. After that, your behavior will be logged as a direct impediment to operational readiness during a critical phase." He laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the metal walls. "Or what, little girl? You'll write me a stern report." She finally moved her gaze from the chronometer to his face. She did not react. She did not rush. She did not fear. She simply looked at him, and for the first time something flickered across his features: uncertainty. It was like being analyzed by a piece of sophisticated machinery, coldly assessed and found wanting. The chronometer continued its countdown. 59 seconds, 58, 57. Seconds later, everyone went silent for a very different reason. But this confrontation had not started with a hand against a wall. It had started 3 weeks earlier, with the quiet arrival of a single transport shuttle against the howling winds of the Arctic expanse. The station, a deep-bore geothermal research facility designated Icefall Base, was a world unto itself. A metal iceberg drilled into the polar cap, a place of recycled air, artificial light, and the constant crushing pressure of isolation. The men here were a specific breed. Rough, hardened by the environment and the tedious nature of their work. The major had cultivated a culture that mirrored his own image: loud, aggressive, reliant on a rigid, almost feudal chain of command. He was the lord of this frozen castle, and his word was law. Then she arrived. She carried a single Pelican case and a data slate. Nothing else. No fanfare, no introduction, no explanation beyond what was necessary. She had no rank insignia, only a title: specialist. Her orders, classified at a level above the major's own clearance, simply stated she was here for a system audit of the new reactor core. The director himself, the institutional authority from a continent away, had signed them. The major saw her as an insult. She was small. He prided himself on the physicality of his security team, all men over 6 feet tall, all with backgrounds in frontline combat units. She was quiet. He ran his command through booming orders and public corrections. She was analytical. He solved problems with blunt force and intimidation. Her very presence was a contradiction to the world he had built. From the moment she stepped off that transport, she became a ghost. She moved through the station's corridors with an economy of motion that was unsettling. She did not socialize in the mess hall. She did not participate in the recreational activities, the card games, the loud conversations about missions past. She spent her time in the reactor control room, a silent observer watching the flow of data on the main console. Her quarters were Spartan: a bunk, a desk, and that sealed Pelican case which was never out of her sight. The men, taking their cue from the major, treated her with a mixture of suspicion and condescending amusement. They called her the accountant or the librarian. They made jokes just loud enough for her to hear as she passed in the corridors. She never acknowledged them, Not once. Her silence was her shield and her weapon, but it was not the silence of timidity or fear. It was the silence of a predator, perfectly still, conserving energy, observing the ecosystem of its new environment. Every joke, every sidelong glance, every dismissive gesture was logged, analyzed, and filed away in that analytical mind of hers. She was building a psychological schematic of the crew, most especially its commander. She was learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their assumptions. And in that frozen world where men thought themselves kings, she was mapping the territory with a precision they could not begin to comprehend. There was one person who began to see the truth. A young technician, barely out of training, assigned to assist her. The major had given him this duty like it was a punishment, a joke. Babysit the accountant. Make sure she doesn't break anything important. But the technician had watched her work. He had seen her interface with the station's core programming, her fingers moving over the holographic console with a speed and precision he had never witnessed in his life. She was not just running diagnostics. She was having a conversation with the machine, understanding its language in a way that went beyond technical training. It was instinct, intuition, mastery. She wrote new subroutines in minutes that would have taken his entire team weeks to draft. She spotted microfractures in the energy conduits by analyzing tertiary resonance feedback, something the station's own automated systems had completely missed. The technician tried to look her up in the service database one night, curiosity getting the better of him. Her file was a wall of black redactions. No FOD, no service history, no background. Just a single chilling commendation from the aftermath of something called the series station incident, an event so catastrophic that its full details were still sealed at the highest levels of classification. The commendation read, "For demonstrating unparalleled diagnostic and resolution capabilities under conditions of total system collapse, sole survivor." Sole survivor. The technician stared at those two words for a long time. He began to understand that he was not assisting a technician. He was in the presence of someone who had walked through hell and come out the other side carrying knowledge that most people would never possess. He started watching the major's behavior not with amusement anymore, but with a growing sense of dread. He knew, with an instinct he could not explain, that the major was goading a force of nature he could not possibly comprehend. The major's arrogance was a physical presence. It radiated from him, shaping the atmosphere of every room he entered. He saw the specialist's quiet competence not as a resource but as a challenge to his authority. Her refusal to be intimidated was, in his mind, an act of defiance that needed to be crushed. He needed to break her. He needed to do it publicly in front of his men to reassert the natural order of his kingdom. The mess hall, he decided, would be the perfect theater for this performance. He had cornered her as she was getting a cup of coffee, the one ritual she seemed to permit herself. He started with condescending questions about her progress, his voice dripping with false concern. "Finding everything in order, specialist. Our systems are quite robust, built and maintained by real field operators, not lab coats." She had simply nodded, her attention on the dark liquid filling her cup. Her lack of engagement infuriated him. He needed a reaction. He needed her to show fear or anger or anything that would validate his dominance in front of his men. "You know," he continued, stepping closer, forcing her back against the bulkhead, "some people might think sending a woman to do a man's job in a place like this is a mistake, a distraction. It takes a certain kind of fortitude to operate effectively here." This was the moment he chose to slam his hand against the wall. This was the performance. And this was the moment she gave her perfectly timed, perfectly delivered warning. The chronometer on the wall ticked down. 59 seconds, 58. The major's face, which had been flushed with theatrical anger, began to show genuine confusion. This was not in his script. She was supposed to shrink away, to stammer, to appeal to his mercy. Instead, she stood there, calm as winter ice, counting down the seconds like she was timing a chemical reaction. "You're serious," he said, and there was the first hint of doubt in his voice. 43 seconds, Major." He did not move his hand. Pride would not allow it, not in front of his men, not when he had already committed to this show of dominance. The specialist simply waited, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. The men around them had gone completely silent now, sensing that something had shifted, that the script they thought they knew was being rewritten in real time. 30 seconds. The Major's jaw tightened. He was trapped between his ego and a growing, irrational sense that he had made a terrible miscalculation. But he could not back down. Not now. Not after everything he had said. 15 seconds. Her voice was clinical, devoid of emotion, devoid of satisfaction or fear. She was simply stating facts, measuring time, performing a function. The chronometer hit 0. The specialist's hand moved with smooth, practiced efficiency. She tapped her data slate twice. No flourish, no drama, just 2 deliberate touches on the screen. Then she looked at him one more time, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made every man in that room lean in to hear. "Thank you, Major. Your cooperation with this assessment has been noted." She picked up her coffee and walked away, her footsteps measured and calm against the metal deck. The Major stood there, his hand still pressed against the bulkhead, and for the first time in his career, he felt something he had never experienced in his own domain. He felt fear, not of physical harm, but of something far more dangerous. He had just been outmaneuvered, and he did not even understand how. 25 men watched him lower his hand, watched him try to recover his composure, watched him pretend that nothing significant had just happened. But they had all felt it, the shift in the air, the crack in the foundation of his authority. The next 2 weeks were a study in mounting tension. The Major tried to reassert control through increasingly aggressive displays, surprise inspections at odd hours, public reprimands for minor infractions, loud pronouncements about discipline and the chain of command. But there was a new current running through Icefall Base, a quiet undermining of everything he represented. The specialist continued her work, methodical and thorough, moving through the station like a ghost, observing, documenting, saying nothing. The technician watched her access systems he did not even know existed, watched her interface with security protocols that should have been beyond her clearance level. She was building something, preparing something, but he could not figure out what. Then, on a Tuesday morning during the station's artificial dawn cycle, the alarms began to scream. It started as a low hum, then escalated into a piercing wail that drove needles of sound through every corridor, every compartment, every corner of Icefall Base. Red emergency lights strobed against metal walls. The reactor core, the heart of the station, the machine that kept them all alive in this frozen wasteland, was cascading toward a critical failure. The automated systems, the fail-safes that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe, had not just failed. They had failed in sequence, in a pattern that suggested something far worse than random malfunction. Panic spread like wildfire. Men ran through corridors, shouting questions that had no answers. The Major burst into the central control room, his face red, his voice booming orders that made no sense, that addressed symptoms rather than causes. "Seal the blast doors. Get a team to the reactor. Somebody tell me what's happening." Nobody could tell him. The main console was a cascade of red warnings, error messages scrolling faster than anyone could read them. The reactor temperature was climbing. The containment field was fluctuating. The cooling systems were offline. Every backup, every redundancy, every safety measure they had relied on for years was failing simultaneously. The station had minutes, maybe less, before the core reached critical mass. After that, the explosion would vaporize Icefall Base and everyone in it, leaving nothing but a crater in the ice and a classified incident report that would be buried in some government archive. The specialist walked into the control room like she was stepping into an office on any other morning. No running, no panic. She carried her data slate and that pelican case, moving through the chaos with the same economy of motion she always displayed. The Major saw her and something in him snapped. "Where have you been?" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "This is your fault. Your audit, your interference with our systems." She did not respond. She simply walked past him to the main console, set down her Pelican case, and opened it with two precise clicks. Inside was equipment the technician had never seen before, military-grade hardware that looked like it belonged in a classified research facility, not in the hands of a system auditor. She connected 3 cables to the main console with practiced efficiency, her fingers flying across the holographic interface, and then she spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Major, I need you to be quiet." Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was a command delivered with such absolute authority that the major actually stopped shouting. He stood there, mouth open, watching her work. The entire control room fell silent except for the screaming alarms and the sound of her fingers on the console. She was typing code directly into the reactor's core programming, bypassing every safety lockout, every security protocol, accessing systems that should have been impossible to reach without the director's personal authorization. "Cooling systems are locked out due to a cascade failure in the primary control node," she said, her voice clinical and calm. "Rerouting power through the secondary grid, bypassing the automated safety protocols and switching to manual control." Her hands moved faster. The technician, standing behind her, could barely follow what she was doing. She was rewriting the reactor's operating system in real time, creating new pathways for energy flow, manually regulating processes that were supposed to be automated. It should have been impossible. It should have taken a team of engineers hours to even attempt. She was doing it alone in minutes, while the temperature gauge climbed higher and the countdown to critical mass ticked away. "Temperature is at 92% of critical threshold," she said, and there was still no emotion in her voice. "Initiating emergency coolant flush. Major, I need authorization to vent the primary heat exchangers into the external environment." The major stared at her, his face pale. "That will freeze half the station's water supply." "We will be alive to replace it. Authorization code, Major, now." He stammered out the code. She entered it without looking at him, her eyes fixed on the cascading data streams. The station shuddered as massive vents opened in the outer hull, expelling superheated gas into the Arctic night. The temperature gauge began to drop, slowly at first, then faster. 90%, 85, 79. The red warnings began to turn yellow, then green. The alarms, one by one, fell silent. The specialist continued working for another 10 minutes, stabilizing systems, running diagnostics, ensuring that every subsystem was properly synchronized. Only when the last indicator turned green did she finally step back from the console. The control room was dead silent. Every man in that space, including the major, was staring at her. She closed her Pelican case with 2 precise clicks, disconnected her cables, and then turned to face the room. Her expression had not changed. She looked exactly as she had when she walked in, calm, analytical, unmoved. "The reactor is stable," she said quietly. "The cascade failure was caused by a deterioration in the primary control node that your automated systems failed to detect. I have implemented a temporary fix, but the node will need to be replaced within 72 hours. I will submit a full technical report to the director." The major found his voice, and it came out as a croak. How did you know what to do?" She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that made him take a step back. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was simply the cold, analytical assessment of someone who understood him completely and found him fundamentally lacking. "Because this is what I do, Major. This is what I have always done." She picked up her Pelican case and walked out of the control room, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any words could have carried. The technician looked at the major and saw a man whose entire identity had just been shattered. The arrogant, booming commander who had ruled Icefall Base through intimidation and physical presence had just been shown the difference between perceived authority and actual competence. He had frozen in the crisis. She had saved them all. Within an hour, the director was on the comm link from headquarters, his face filling the main screen in the central control room. The major had called him, spinning a narrative of heroic leadership and team coordination, trying to salvage what remained of his reputation. But he had made a critical mistake. He had forgotten that Icefall Base recorded everything. Every camera, every microphone, every system log. The station's black box had captured the entire incident in perfect, objective detail. The specialist entered the control room while the major was still talking, still weaving his fiction. She did not interrupt. She simply walked to the console and placed her personal data slate on it, syncing it with the main terminal. Then she looked up at the director's face on the screen and spoke. "Director, I have synced the station's black box recorder with this terminal. It contains all audio, video, and system telemetry from the incident. I believe it is the only report you will require." The major's face went white. "I will play the relevant 12 minutes, she said, her voice clinical, and she did. The main screen split into multiple windows. One showed the security footage from the control room during the crisis. Another displayed the raw scrolling data from the reactor core. A third showed the station's internal schematics with failing systems highlighted in red. A fourth window displayed biometric readings of key personnel, their heart rates, stress levels, cognitive function indicators. And there was audio. They all heard it again. The alarms, the panic shouts. The major's voice not calm and decisive, but confused and impotent. "Comms are down. Seal the blast doors. No, wait, get a team to the reactor." They heard him shouting contradictory orders, freezing in the moment when leadership was most critical. Then they heard her voice, calm and precise, delivering commands with effortless authority. Cooling systems locked out, rerouting power, bypassing automated protocols. Temperature at 92%, initiating emergency flush. The video showed the major standing uselessly by the wall, his hands shaking, while she orchestrated the station's salvation with cold precision. The biometric data was the most damning evidence of all. His heart rate had skyrocketed into the panic zone, his stress levels off the charts, his cognitive function dropping as adrenaline and fear overwhelmed his capacity for rational thought. In contrast, her readouts were a flat line of inhuman calm. Her heart rate barely elevated. Her stress levels remained stable. Her cognitive function indicators peaked at a level the station's medical officer had never seen before. The recording played on, showing her working alone at the console while 20 men stood frozen, watching her save their lives. It showed the countdown to critical mass, the moment when the temperature gauge began to drop, the systematic restoration of every failed system. It was all there, captured in cold, objective data that could not be argued with, could not be reinterpreted, could not be spun into a convenient narrative. When the recording finished, the room was utterly silent. The major's men, who had stood behind him for years, could not look at him now. They stared at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at the man whose lies had just been so clinically dissected. The major himself was shaking, not with rage, but with the tremors of a man whose entire identity had been publicly and irrevocably dismantled. The director's face returned to the screen, filling all the windows. His eyes were like chips of granite, cold and unforgiving. He looked at the major, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of final judgment. "Major, your command is terminated, effective immediately. You will be confined to your quarters until the next transport arrives. You will be flown back to headquarters to face a board of inquiry. Your career in the service is over." He did not shout. He did not need to. Each word was a nail in the coffin of the major's professional life. The director then looked at the specialist, and the hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by something that looked almost like weary respect. "Specialist," he said, and for the first time he used her name. It was a name that carried weight, a name from the redacted files, a name the technician had only seen in that commendation, a name that was a legend in the quiet corners of the service where true competence was revered. Hearing the director say it aloud felt like declassifying a state secret. "I apologize that you were forced to operate in such an unprofessional environment. It will not happen again. He paused, then delivered the final institutional correction. Per Special Order 7 Alpha, you are assuming full operational command of Icefall Base until a suitable replacement for the former major can be found. Your authority is absolute. Is that understood? Every man in the room, including the major's most loyal officers, straightened to attention. The specialist simply nodded once, her expression unchanged. Understood, Director. The screen went blank. The major, a broken man, was escorted from the room by two of his own security personnel. He did not look at her as he left. He could not. Looking at her would have meant confronting the reality of everything he had just lost, everything he had never really possessed in the first place. The door sealed behind him with a pneumatic hiss, and the control room remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly, the men began to move again, returning to their stations, speaking in quiet voices, processing what they had just witnessed. The new quiet at Icefall Base was different from the old silence. The loud, performative masculinity of the major's reign was gone, replaced by a hushed, focused professionalism. The men no longer joked or postured for status. They worked with purpose. They spoke in quieter tones, measuring their words. They moved through the corridors with a new sense of respect for the machine they lived inside. The specialist became their commander, but she did not command from an office or through booming declarations. She was a presence moving through the station, observing, fine-tuning, optimizing every system with the same analytical precision she had brought to the reactor crisis. She spoke only when necessary, but when she did, her words carried the undeniable weight of earned authority. She held training sessions not on combat tactics or security procedures, but on system architecture and cascade failure theory. She taught them to understand the machine they lived inside, to respect it, to listen to its language. She taught them that the most powerful weapon was not a rifle or a rank insignia, but a deep and comprehensive understanding of the battlefield. And for them, in that frozen world, the battlefield was the station itself. The technician became her second in command, not by rank, but by merit. He thrived under her mentorship, his own quiet competence finally allowed to flourish without being overshadowed by the major's need for dominance displays. He learned to see patterns in data that he had missed before, to anticipate system failures before they cascaded, to think like she thought, with cold precision and absolute focus. The story of the incident became a legend, a cautionary tale passed between new arrivals who rotated through Icefall Base. It was a story about the difference between perceived strength and actual strength, about the fatal liability of arrogance, about the chilling power of disciplined competence. But the specialist did not change. She had not been on a journey of transformation. She had not grown or evolved or overcome some internal weakness. The station had changed. Its culture had been forcibly corrected by the crisis she had solved. The world's perception of her had simply been aligned with the reality of who she had always been. She was a master of her craft, a survivor of catastrophes that would have broken lesser minds, a living fail-safe deployed to places where competence was not optional but mandatory for survival. One evening, near the end of her time at Icefall, the technician found her in the observatory dome, a small space at the top of the station with reinforced windows that looked out onto the Arctic sky. She rarely visited it, preferring the hum and glow of the reactor control room. But tonight she was there, standing alone, watching the aurora borealis dance across the darkness. The lights shimmered in curtains of green and violet, silent and beautiful, a natural display of electromagnetic forces that reminded him how small they all were, how fragile their metal bubble in the ice truly was. "It never gets easier, does it?" the technician asked quietly, standing beside her. He was not talking about the job. He was talking about the burden of her skill, the weight of the past that had forged it, the knowledge that came from being the sole survivor of something terrible. She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the celestial display. The aurora played across her features, making her seem less like a person and more like a fundamental force of nature, something elemental and unchanging. Ease is not the objective, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Control is. The hardest fight is always internal. You master yourself, you master the chaos. Everything else is just a variable. This was her creed, the philosophy that had saved them all, the lesson her mentor had taught her before whatever had happened at Ceres Station, the promise she had made over graves that existed only in redacted files. True strength is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not perform for an audience. It does not need validation or applause. It simply is. And when a crisis comes, when the alarms scream and systems fail and men freeze in panic, that quiet strength is the only kind that matters. The specialist remained at Icefall Base for another 2 months, restructuring its protocols, training the new commander who eventually arrived from headquarters, ensuring that the culture she had imposed would outlast her presence. Then, as quietly as she had arrived, she left. A single transport shuttle against the howling wind, a single Pelican case, a single data slate. She left behind a legacy, a new standard, a quiet but permanent correction in the way Icefall Base operated. She went back into the quiet corners of the service, a ghost in the machine, a living fail-safe, waiting for the next crisis, the next arrogant commander who would mistake her stillness for weakness, the next system on the edge of catastrophic failure that needed someone who understood control. She would be ready. She was always ready, because true strength does not need to prove itself until the moment demands it, and in that moment it does not hesitate, does not doubt, does not fail. Sometimes dignity does not speak. It simply acts. And in the silence that follows, the world realigns itself around the truth it tried so hard to ignore.